Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 395, Becoming a Jewish Kind of Person. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we are thrilled to be continuing our series about converting to Judaism with our very first guest ever on Judaism Unbound and our most frequently recurring guest, Benay Lappe. I'll have a lot more to say about Benay Lappe in just a moment, but before we give her that full introduction, it is time to launch our next round of full semester courses that will be offered in Judaism Unbound's Unyeshiva this fall, our digitally driven center for Jewish learning and unlearning. You can get all the information, including full descriptions for all the courses, by heading to judaismunbound.com/classes. But to entice you to go over there, we want to give you a quick description of these classes today. Class number 1, Eliana Light, a musician and educator, our guest on episode 132, will be teaching a course entitled Prayer Unbound, a Jewish Liturgy Laboratory. Our second class is taught by Karen Aviv, our guest on episode 213. Karen Aviv is the rabbinic and program director at Judaism Your Way, and will be teaching a class called Unlearning Jewish Anxiety. Third, Rachel Rose Reed, a Kohenet, that's a Hebrew priestess. We've had a number of episodes exploring the role of the Kohenet, although we have not yet had Rachel Rose Reed on the podcast. Rachel Rose Reed is a storyteller and ritual crafter and will be teaching a course entitled Crafting Jewishly Rooted Ritual. Fourth, Yoshi Silverstein, our guest on episode 360, the founder and executive director of Mitsui Collective, will be teaching a class entitled Embodied Jewish Transformation, Pathways of Possibility. And finally, last but certainly not least, Tamar Kamienkowski, a scholar who bridges biblical scholarship and contemporary Jewish life, will be teaching a course called God, Gods, Goddesses, Godexes, Diverse Theologies in Tanakh. That's Hebrew Bible. Tamar Kamienkowski has not been a guest on Judaism Unbound yet, but that is about to change, so stay tuned very soon. So again, for all these classes, just head over to judaismunbound.com/classes for all the info that you need about them. You can register for any of these classes, or I would recommend for all of them right now. Now back to today's episode with our guest, Benay Lappe. Now, you may know Benay Lappe as the president and Rosh Yeshiva of Svara, a traditionally radical yeshiva, and of course she is that. But the reason Benay is on our show today is that for the last 3 years, really for long before that, but officially live on the air for the last 3 years, Benay has been my chavruta, my study partner, as we have been learning Talmud together in public on a streaming video show called The Oral Talmud. If you don't know about The Oral Talmud and you would be interested in learning Talmud through a kind of unbound, traditionally radical lens, you can go to oraltalmud.com and check out all of our past episodes. We actually just had episode 156. On the Oral Talmud over the last few months, Benay and I have been studying a number of major passages from the Talmud that explore the question of conversion to Judaism. Now, some of that is because we are interested in the subject of conversion to Judaism in its own right. Another reason that we study the texts about conversion to Judaism is because we have an impulse that thinking about how to convert to Judaism is actually also a really helpful lens to thinking about what Judaism really is all about, what Judaism is for. So if you want to experience, we really studied these texts for months. If you want to experience them, just head over to oraltalmud.com to check them out. But on this episode today, we are going to give you some of those highlights or some of our conclusions from that study. Just a little bit more introduction to Benay so that we can embarrass her a little bit. Benay Lappe, in addition to being the president and Rosh Yeshiva of Svara, has also been named to Jewrotica's Sexiest Rabbis list of 2013, as well as the Forward's 2018 list of Sexiest Jewish Intellectuals Alive. She has also been named to the Forward's 2014 list of Most Inspiring Rabbis and to the 2020 Forward 50 list of the Most Influential American Jews. Benay Lappe has also been a Joshua Venture Fellow, and in 2016 she received the very prestigious Covenant Award for Innovative Jewish Education. We are just always thrilled to have Benay Lappe on the podcast. As we said, she was our very first guest. She has been a frequent guest. So Benay Lappe, welcome back to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you again. We've missed you.
Thank you. It's so great to be back. I missed you both as well.
Well, I haven't really missed you that much because we see each other every week on our other show that we do, the Oral Talmud, and that's really the basis for the conversation that we want to have a little bit. We know that we have a tremendous number of viewers for the Oral Talmud, but not quite as many as for Judaism Unbound. So we're sort of thinking that maybe there are certain ideas that we talked about on the Oral Talmud. Also, by the way, it took us a long time. I think we studied these texts about conversion for like 4 or 5 months. But we wanted to share some of our thinking and some of our conclusions and some of our speculations with the listeners to Judaism Unbound. So I wanted to start just by asking you, as you reflect on all that material that we studied, what are some of the things that are on your mind? What are some of the things that surprised you? What are some of the things that you think are most important in what we studied?
Well, first of all, even before we learned the texts, I knew just vaguely that the process of conversion was much simpler in the Talmud. So I expected to see that there, and we did see that there. But what really surprised me was that I expected the conversation in the Talmud to be a kind of justification for the simplicity of conversion. But what I think we found was that it was actually the reverse, because the Talmud didn't anticipate what would happen 1,500 years hence in our time, which was that conversion has become a very complicated, complex, high barrier to entry, difficult, long process. But rather, it was seeing itself in relation to its past, which was when conversion was even simpler. So what it was it seemed to be invested in doing, which I was surprised at, was justifying how complicated relatively the early rabbis in the Talmud had made conversion. Now, it wasn't complicated, it was super simple. But in relation to their biblical past, it was complicated.
Yeah, I mean, they took it from like a 30-second process to like a 10-minute process.
Exactly. And the technologies they use is the same technology that they use for all innovation, which is to remythologize our origin story, retrojecting their current reality back into it. So they retrojected back into the Ruth and Naomi story, right? The earliest conversion story, which is super simple, like, I'm in. It was basically, I'm in. I'm coming with you and I'm in.
Yeah, that's the 30-second version, right? Your God will be my God, your people are my people. Boom, you're done.
Right. So they made that story actually be the 10-minute version.
And just to put a little meat on the bones of the 10-minute version, bottom line is that the Talmud describes a ceremony or an approach to conversion where basically you have to start by telling somebody like, what are you doing converting to Judaism? Don't you know that the Jews are oppressed? And then they say, oh, I do know, but and I'm not worthy of being part of this, but I really want to. And then you say, okay. And you teach them some of the heavier mitzvot, whatever we want to translate that exactly, commandments or Jewish actions to do, and some of the lighter mitzvot. And you have to tell everybody about a set of mitzvot, a set of practices about how we care for the poor. And then you basically dunk in a mikvah and a ritual bath and it's done. So that's like the 10-minute version. It's really doesn't sound like a lot more than 10 minutes. And so that in contrast to what we have today, which in most cases, there's an expectation that you take a year-long introduction to Judaism class and you maybe even have a test or have to write a paper and, whatever it is. And sometimes it's less and sometimes it's more, but it's still a lot more than that 10-minute version.
Exactly. I think it raises the question, or at least changes the current landscape to be one that doesn't have the weight of 3,000 years of history. I think it makes it a little bit easier to play with. Not that you can't play with everything, even that which has a 3,000-year-old history, but to recognize that the status quo of a certain Jewish process is relatively new, I think frees us up a little bit to say, well, that's not necessarily the way we want to keep doing it. So now I think our question is, how do we want to do conversion now? Do we want to change it? And for me to even begin to think about this question, we should go back to think about, why are we interested in conversion anyway? So I would like to think out that idea or that question. If we're going to talk about conversion, I think we need to start with, why conversion?
So, I mean, I'm interested in that from a couple angles. I will say, for me, some of the question of what are the stakes of conversion boils down to, like, what is the difference between somebody who holds Jewish to be their identity and somebody who doesn't? And it's funny because and in lots of the interfaith advocacy work I do for people who are not Jewish but present in Jewish spaces, like, I often am advocating pretty hard that there shouldn't be that much of a delineation, a distinction between what a Jew can do in Jewish spaces and what somebody who is not Jewish can do in Jewish spaces, without getting into how there's people that sort of straddle that theoretical binary that's not a binary. That question we haven't talked about so much in this unit, but I think it's really important because, like, on the one hand, I want people who are not Jewish to be empowered in Jewish spaces to do a lot of things. And I want people who take on the process of conversion to feel like they've done a thing. Like, so many of the people in this unit, they've said, it means so much to me that I did this process that actually did take a while. And I experienced some holidays, maybe for a whole year, whatever. Like, a lot of them are saying, well, that really spoke to me. And so I have this tension where I'm like, I don't think you should need to do that. I think we should go back to a version closer to the Talmud or Ruth or whatever we want from historical precedent. Whether we go fully back to that or somewhere in the middle, I don't know, but like something simpler. But I'm hearing the feedback that people are growing and liking that process. Now, I'm aware that the people who we've had on the show mostly are folks who they did the process and they're looking back on it. And so, of course, our tendency is to be like, yes, that was meaningful. Like we find meaning in the things we do. And we're not hearing from the people who saw how it was going to take a year or 2 years or whatever. And they said, ooh, that's a lot. I'm not going to do it. And I think there's a lot of those people. We had one episode with Chris Bartlett. But I am curious, like, what are the stakes? Like in the Talmud, I know less. I mean, there are conversations about what people who are of Jewish versus those who are not can do. And I think that's also a different set of stratifications than we have now, where we have, you know, these people can hold the Torah. These people can say this blessing around. These people can be present on a bima. These people can be rabbis. These people, like, there's all those categories. And so I guess I'm curious, how would you weigh that back and forth between we want this to be easier because there's too many barriers in place, and it seems like people actually are liking that they had to do a process. So how do we balance that?
I've also experienced that with potential converts. I've said to potential converts at a certain point, you're ready. And they've said, no, I'm not ready yet. I'm not yet. I want to feel worthy. I want to feel something deeper or some transformation that I haven't felt yet. I would like to interrogate whether an identity change is really what we need. I think people have felt that I'm not ready yet. I want to be transformed because we've put the idea out there into the world that you have to change your identity to access the wisdom and the technologies of Judaism. I think we ought to put a question mark on whether that really needs to be the case. I really want to think this out. Okay. For me, the entire Jewish enterprise, as I've said here before, exists to create a certain kind of person. And that kind of person, a person who is challenging rather than accepting, who can tolerate ambiguity paradox, uncertainty, and so on. That kind of person walks through the world in a certain way and creates a certain kind of world. That kind of world is an outgrowth of us creating certain kinds of people. So I think the goal is the creation of a certain kind of human being. Okay, fine. So we have a whole slew of technologies, rituals, practices, activities, values, ideas to create that kind of person. Seems like it would be a good idea to make these technologies, practices, and so on available to as many people as possible to use, so that if they choose to be a Jewish kind of person, they can. Then I think the question is, what does a person need to do to access and use best all the goodies that we have? Part of our goodies are embedded in community. And I think the identity piece fits into the fact that we've embedded our goodies in community so that people who want to use them sense that they need to be accepted in a community and share a certain identity to fit in order to utilize those things. And I think that, I don't know how much that's a given or something that is just a reality, and that identity has to be part of quote unquote conversion or the project to make Judaism accessible. I'm not sure. But I think the question is, how do we make the spiritual technologies of Judaism usable, accessible, and available to people who do not currently identify as Jewish? To me, that's the big goal.
Well, a few things in what you're saying. First of all, I love the terminology, a Jewish kind of person, because we sort of talked about Jewish adjacent when we had that interview with Chris Bartlett. And I really like the idea of a Jewish kind of person, because I think it's pretty fair to say that Chris Bartlett is a Jewish kind of person, even though he may not be Jewish. And so that opens up a world of possibilities that I want to hold on to. The other thing that, as you were talking, it occurred to me, and I don't think it's something that we've discussed before, that, like you say, and you've said many times, that the Jewish project is to create a certain kind of person. But conversion is about entering into the Jewish project, not concluding the Jewish project. So we shouldn't expect that somebody has to achieve the transformation into a certain kind of person in order to become a Jew.
For sure.
Right? What we're talking, but in a way, like, that's what it feels like the conversion process is asking of people. It's like, dig so deep, dive so deeply into this that it will already transform you before you become a Jew. And one of the things that really struck me the most in some of the earlier texts that we looked at, specifically that really famous story of Hillel and Shammai and the potential convert, right? And there's actually 3 stories. I want to talk about 2 of them. There's the one that's the most famous, where a potential convert comes to Shammai and says, convert me on condition that you can tell me all of Judaism while I'm standing on one foot. And Shammai throws him out. And Hillel says, what is hateful to you, don't do unto another. The rest is commentary. Go and study. But what we don't always note when we tell that story is that Hillel converted him, and then he told him that. We imagine, I think when that story is told, we imagine that Hillel told him that, and then the guy goes off, and maybe he decides to convert down the road. That's a cool answer. But no, in the story, Hillel actually converts him right away. And there's another story in that trilogy. There's 3 stories that are given about similar interactions. My favorite one, because it's so funny, is that this person is walking along and basically walks past a study house, I think, or maybe a synagogue, I don't remember, and they're reading the text about the clothes that the high priest would wear. And this person is so fascinated by the clothes, he wants to wear the clothes. And so he comes to Hillel and Shammai and asks to convert so that he can become the high priest, so that he can wear the clothes, which is funny because really only a Jew can become the high priest, and only a certain tribe of Jews. So really not most Jews can't become the high priest. So the whole idea is supposed to be a little bit ridiculous, that a person wants to convert to Judaism in order to become the high priest. But what really struck me about that is that this person was basically converting to Judaism for the clothes. And Hillel says that's okay.
Right.
And another piece of that is, I think the rabbis are conscious of the new project they're creating, where the priesthood itself is obsolete. So not only are all the things you said true, that it could only be a certain tribe, but like even if all that were the case and this person were somehow magically descended from the right tribe, we're in an era where the priesthood doesn't even matter in the same way.
You know, there was a Seinfeld episode where he accused his dentist of converting to Judaism in order to be able to tell Jewish jokes, right? Or we can imagine situations where somebody wants to become Jewish because they like the food. And I think that that story in the Talmud is telling us that's okay, that that's a way to come into the Jewish people. And then the rabbinic project begins. Then we say, how can Judaism work to transform you into a certain kind of moral, ethical human being who believes that everybody is created in the image of God, et cetera, et cetera?
I agree. And I think we probably need to start with finding a better word than conversion, because conversion sounds like transformation. It sounds like you're becoming something else and then you get in. That creates the problems that you were referring to earlier, Lex. And what comes up for me are models like Buddhist ordination. You become a monk instantly, you are ordained as a monk instantly, and then you start to learn. Or college admission. I don't know. My daughter's applying to college. So for me, everything is about college admissions. There's this fabulous book called Colleges That Change Lives. And I don't know, there are maybe 24 colleges in these are typically small liberal arts colleges that don't have the big brand name recognition. And the descriptions all say the same thing, essentially. And that is, we take kids who are a little rough around the edges, kids who have potential, the ones who haven't proven that they're, sort of like Harvard material, but we turn out human beings who are like this, XYZ. If we had a colleges that change lives attitude about conversion, it would be a kind of admissions process. Like the quote unquote conversion would be, come on in. We think we've got something good enough that's going to help you do that transformation. Hey, okay, so this just occurred to me. What if the whole conversion industrial complex that has arisen, that has made conversion so big, actually has to do with our flagging confidence in Judaism itself to transform people? And so we've made the entry requirement the transformation process because we're not quite sure anymore what's going to happen to you once you're in. What if that? Oh my goodness. But actually, I have a lot more confidence. So we don't have to make the process of coming in the transformation project. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I've been thinking a lot about colleges in this unit, but I haven't been thinking about the admission process. I think that's a beautiful connection. And I think it's really interesting to me because, like, nobody thinks that the process of filling out an application, like, I mean, maybe I'm cynical. I don't believe that college admissions counselors think that the people filling out their applications, even if they visited the campus, like, they really understand the school they're going to. And they the understanding is you get a little taste, you go to the website, you hopefully you visit campus if you can, and then you apply to a place that you're going to be at for 4 transformative years of your life. You could say it's like terrifying, but I actually think, no, like that's how we go about a lot of things that are fundamentally transformational, which is you get a little taste, you're in,
right.
And then once you're in, you figure it out. I've been thinking about fraternity and sorority initiations, which I was in one, I was in a Jewish one. So it actually, there's ways in which part of our process, because our fraternity had some Jews and some not, was about learning some really basic things about Jewishness.
Yeah. By the way, I was in a Jewish sorority as well.
There you go. And so, like, but I think that process is really interesting, and I think we don't unpack it enough because for a lot of us, and I include myself in this, we think that fraternal organizations are like deeply toxic in all sorts of ways, especially all male ones like the one I was in. But the process of joining a fraternity and sorority, when Rush is happening, the fraternities and sororities are really recruiting, like the power dynamics are inverted. They don't have anybody in yet. So they're doing active outreach to try and get like the coolest, most exciting new people into their houses. And I don't think Judaism thinks of itself as doing Rush, ever. I'd be interested if we did think of ourselves as doing Rush. Because Rush is not like, let's find random people. It's finding what you were terming like the Jewish kind of person, or the insert X fraternity, insert X sorority kind of person. When I was in a fraternity, there were certain people that we believed were out there that probably wouldn't learn about us. But if we do the outreach, then they will, and then we'll really be a good fit for them, and we'll enrich their lives. They'll enrich our house. That ethos would be really good. And then what's interesting is you basically are in. So like there's the whole pledge process, right? And we could talk about, there's hazing and there's, I think that our conversion has some hazing. I actually think that that's part of our traditional processes. There are things that I would mark as hazing, things that are not desirable that people are forced to do in order to join sometimes. But you're kind of in from the get-go. When in most fraternities and sororities, you rush, then you like accept a bid or whatever, and then like the first day you get your little pledge pin, or you are like publicly representing that project to everyone. You're not fully in yet, and then after a month or a couple months or whatever, you're in. And so it inverts our notion of how people have to work and work and work in order to even get to the place where they could represent Judaism. And so I guess I'm curious to either of you to keep going with the admissions parallel or the fraternity rush parallel, like if that's landing and helping to reconfigure this process that I agree should not be called conversion, but probably something else.
I love the fraternity sorority model. Here are a couple of things that occur to me. One is that the child of someone in a fraternity or sorority sticky on this issue in colleges is called a legacy, right? And that means that person is automatically accepted if they choose to pledge, which is could be an interesting shift for conversion from the lineal model, right? Like, Dan, your idea that your children shouldn't necessarily be obligated to be Jewish just because you are, right? And they may have some sort of legacy privilege, maybe, but they have to also pledge to exercise that legacy privilege. They're not just automatically by birth Jewish, maybe, just like my daughter isn't necessarily in AE5 simply because I was. But, you know, she has a little bit of a greased entryway if she chooses to go that way. So I kind of like that other piece of the sorority fraternity model. I'm liking the easy admission, and the thing happens when you're there. And that's what we saw in the Talmud, right? Those stories about Hillel. It's like, okay, you're in. Now, the first thing that happens is you start learning.
One question that arose for me a lot in our learning that we were talking about as we were doing it, but maybe this is an opportunity to talk about it even more as a central topic of conversation, is this question of, once we see the dynamism of how Judaism works by studying the Talmud, and we see that they were essentially inventing a new way to be a Jew, and I think it's an open question whether there was this real easy conversion that existed before, or they imagined an easy conversion that existed in the time of Ruth. Maybe it was easy in the sense that there wasn't really any such thing as conversion so much until a certain period. It was just like when a woman would marry a Jewish husband, she would immediately become Jewish. That was not anything about Judaism. That was about the status of women in that time. And there wasn't really a way for a man to become a Jew. And then eventually they invented one for both, right? And there are some things that we read about that are for women and for men. And anyway, they were kind of inventing a new way to be part of this. One thing that we can do, and I think it's the temptation to do it, is to look back at the Talmud and say, hey, look, it was so much easier back then. Something happened over the last 1,500 years that's made it really hard to convert to Judaism. We don't like that. Let's go back to the way it was 1,500 years ago. And the truth is that I wouldn't really be against that. But like we've been talking about, I think that that might leave an opportunity on the table, which is to change the way we think about this status completely. And to say, rather than looking at a world of Jews and non-Jews, and then this is about how do you change status from non-Jew to Jew, we actually have an opportunity. And, you know, maybe this connects to our minds being open about the the gender continuum, that we understand that gender, we used to think of it as a binary, and now we think of it as a spectrum. Could that also be a place to look for guidance as to how to think about Judaism, and potentially looking at what the Talmud is doing? They're really inventing a completely new category and then a new way to get to that category. That what would it look like if we invented a new category today that would be something other than, are you a Jew or a non-Jew? It's something like, you're a Jewish kind of person. And that's not actually a status change. That's something else. And I hear what Lex was saying earlier on, that there are a lot of people out there that want the status change. They should be able to have it. This is not instead of, but this might be in addition to.
A Kinsey scale is what I'm hearing Dan call for.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Yeah. I think the question of identity and what has happened in the world that has made identity as a thing so important is something we need to look at. But for me, the point is about utilizing the wisdom and, like I said, the technologies of Judaism. And that has nothing to do with identity. I think about sort of the whole quote unquote gay issue. And what happened in the Jewish world, in the last 30, 40 years or so, was that rabbis and law committees and such overlaid identity onto what was native to Judaism that related to quote unquote homosexuality. And it wasn't identity, it was about behavior. They sort of vilified identity when identity wasn't even anything Judaism recognized. So regardless of one's sexual practices, if you had queer identity, you were seen as problematic.
You're saying that in the Torah, for example, it says that you shouldn't engage in homosexual activities, but it's not saying one way or the other about somebody who has a homosexual identity, right? And that somehow in the modern era, that got confused, and you were saying that before various changes were made to various laws in like conservative Judaism, there was some sense of condemnation towards people with a gay or lesbian identity, where there's actually no source for that in the Torah or in Judaism at all.
That's right. And in the queer world, identity became important, I think, because it was a way to find people you were safe with. And it was a way to create community that would be kind of a safe refuge from an oppressive world. So identity was useful to sort of find your people, to develop defenses. But if that's not really what you need to do, I wonder if identity is actually getting in our way when we think about the best way to make Jewish wisdom accessible to people.
Yeah. I mean, so you're bringing up a framework that I really like, which is this word, like accessible. How do we make Judaism more accessible to people? I think once that's your driving question, we've already, in a sense, won whoever that person is to a framework that I want them to be in, as opposed to a different one. And what I mean by that is, I think a lot of Jews' driving question, and Jews by birth especially, their driving question with conversion is, what if people join our group, Jewish, without sufficient learning or acculturation to Jew? Like, what if they don't know X, Y, or Z, but are marked as Jewish, and so then something bad happens? And when your abstract question is, what are we nervous about when people who are not us become us? The takeaway is, we're going to do a bunch of things, we're going to create a bunch of processes so that it is less and less likely that somebody could like fall through the cracks without learning the proper quote unquote things or knowing the proper quote unquote ways of being Jewish. That's a nativist set of questions. And I'm not saying like, ooh, everybody who thinks that is evil, but in a basic sense of what nativism is, it is placing a skepticism on people who are not us and assuming as a starting point that if they don't become like us in X, Y, or Z way, they shouldn't be us because they'll change stuff. And that change is marked as bad. That when people are nativists and they don't want immigrants coming into a country, it's because they anticipate change happening and they don't like that. They like things as they are. And so I actually want to tie this to your broader crash theory, Benay, because I think a huge part of what leads to people's fundamental questions with conversion is whether or not they think Judaism is in a massive time of transition or not, and if that's good. For the three of us, we think Judaism is in a massive time of transition, and we like that. And we are excited that in 100 years, to quote you, Benay, Judaism will look unrecognizable to us, and that's exciting and good. If you want an unrecognizable Judaism and are excited by that, you're going to look at conversion and say, oh, there's a bunch of people that could come in and change Judaism. Positive inflection in your voice. If you don't like the idea of an unrecognizable Judaism in 100 years, you're going to say, oh, there's a bunch of people who are going to come into Judaism and change Judaism. I just said the same sentence, but it comes down to whether you are excited about that change or not. I'm not here to say what some people like to say, which is in all sorts of realms, like, oh, when people immigrate, they become just like us. No, stuff does change when newbies come in. If a bunch of people who are not Jewish become Jewish, they will, in fact, change what Judaism is. I'm not here to say, no. They'll learn exactly what we are. I'm here to say, that's great. So I guess I'm curious, Benay, do you think that the broader question of your crash theory of this time of transition we're in plays a role here?
I think you're 100% on target. And I think the rabbis were engaged in a project of actively bringing in people from the outside precisely in order to facilitate the growth of this very newfangled, we can't even imagine it because we're too deeply embedded in the old, but these people will help us think of how to do it better. I think it was a very thought out process by the rabbis, a recruitment effort to bring in people who were different. So it's not an accident that the institution of conversion really became a thing when Judaism was crashing. And I think we're at a similar moment. And I agree that when you're in a moment of crash, to make a quote unquote conversion process, the process of becoming steeped in the way things have been but won't be, it's just wrongheaded. We're not quite sure what a quote unquote good Jew is going to look like in 100 years. You know, last night I Googled conversion just to see what's out there. And the first thing that popped up was a My Jewish Learning article on conversion. And it framed conversion in the different movements as different conceptions of what a good Jew is. Well, okay, fine. I don't love that framing, but even if you accept that framing, it doesn't make any sense in a crash era, because whatever a good Jew looks like, no matter what movement you're in, that's probably not what a good Jew is going to look like when we rework this thing. The entry process has to be different if you're in a stable time versus if you're in a time of change. So for me, the question may not be, don't you realize that Jews are a beleaguered, oppressed minority? And why do you want to come in? And do you realize that's what you're in for? Maybe the entry question is going to be, we're in the midst of figuring out what we're going to be. Do you want to be in on the figuring out project? If your answer is yes, you're in. If your answer is no, I want to be that kind of Jew like I saw over there, then it's like, go somewhere else.
I've said, and it's interesting because in my mind, it wasn't my version of that entry question. Don't you know that the Jews are so oppressed? Because I was raised on this notion that for somebody to convert to Judaism or to convert to anything, they must really love it the way it is. And so they'll be like the most sort of old school in a way, ironically, right? You would think ironically, but it makes sense, actually. And when I've talked to people who are in the process of converting to Judaism, and I've said some version of, well, but Judaism is in this transition. Like, what does it even mean to convert to Judaism to you? Because we don't even really know what Judaism is. They say, that's why I'm doing it. That's what I like. That I'm coming from a tradition that is so certain about what it is and what its theological claims are. And I don't agree with those. But I'm not necessarily looking to jump into another set of theological claims that I'm not sure if I agree with, because I probably will end up not agreeing with those. So I love the idea of jumping into something that is in a transitional period.
I want to ask a question that's sort of the inverse of what I asked before. We spent a lot of time on this show talking about how Jewish institutions are worried about X, Y, and Z. My issue is they're worried about the wrong things. Not that they're worried. We should all be worried about lots of things. What I want us to be worried about is, what if there are amazing Jews out there, or one-day Jews out there, who they're holding, like, I'm going to say the intervention. Like, I'm thinking of academic terms because we've been talking about colleges. Like, there's people who learn about religious studies and then they sort of extend the way the field has been in religious studies, or pick your field. And there's other scholars who come around every once in a while, and they fundamentally they identify an intervention that upends what the field even is and takes it in a new direction. What I spend my days nervous about is, what if the people, and I think it's plural, I don't think it's one individual, but what if the people who would take Judaism and upend it in the ways that we'd need for it to be the best version of itself are A, not Jewish, and B, if they are Jewish, they're not being empowered to do the upending work that they need to do. Those are the things I'm worried about, because I think it is very likely that whoever those people are will be new or new-ish to Jewish, because that's who comes up with new ideas, is people who are coming from other idea systems and blending them with the old. So I really think the stakes of this are really high. And I'm not going to make up a number. I don't know if it's thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions, whatever the number is, it doesn't matter. But there are people out there who they would make our Jewish communities better. And I don't just mean like they would provide a warm body so that the quantity is higher. That's the continuity thing. That's not what I'm interested in. I mean that the content of their contributions, what they would do at the front of rooms, once empowered to be at the front of rooms, what they would contribute in texts, what art they'd create, what communities they would build that are pushing against the existing one. Like, that is all potentially not happening from thousands upon thousands of people, because they look at what it takes to become Jewish, to convert, quote unquote, and they say I don't have the time. So I guess I'm curious, like, how might we, because people are motivated by arguments of fear. I don't want to pretend they're not. What are we afraid of?
Conversion is an existential question. It's a survival question, not because we need numbers to survive. It's because we need people who think differently to help us with the Do Judaism Differently project. That's what the rabbis needed to create Rabbinic Judaism, which lasted for 2,000 years. That was, as we know, disproportionately a product of the converts who came in and rolled up their sleeves along with the rabbis, who were disproportionately converts and children of converts. Okay, so what are we afraid of? What are the risks? I think that's it, right? What are the risks of an approach which has a lower bar to entry?
So my question is sort of it's what are we worried about if we don't lower the threshold? But I mean, it might be worth answering the question that others ask, which is like, what bad happens if the barriers are too low? But what if the barriers are too high and that's leading to the people we need not joining?
That's a really bad situation. What we're left with is sort of a force field which is created by people who have been steeped in the way things have been, suppressing the few people who are able to escape that force field into a creativity. And it's a very difficult situation. You know, at Svara, my yeshiva, we are experiencing how challenging it is to be so far out from the center of the old Judaism that there is no ecosystem around us to support us. It's very tough. If we don't find ways to bring in people into this new cosmic force field, those projects that are really working on a new Judaism, I think will starve.
It brings me back to the origins of Judaism Unbound. For any product, for any community, for anything, there are more non-users of that product than there are users. And so if you want to have a paradigm shift of some kind, you might be better off trying to sell the new version to non-users of the old version rather than trying to sell it to users of the old version. That's not what you would normally think. You would normally think, well, the existing users, aren't they our best potential customer base for the new version? And the answer is that often they're not. And then the question is, what does that really look like? And when we started this podcast, I think we were mostly thinking about people who are currently Jews who are not participating in the institutions of the American Jewish community. But it wasn't too long after that where we started thinking about, wow, there's even more non-users of Judaism in any way, i.e. non-Jews. And so what would it look like to have a version of Judaism that was extremely attractive to people that aren't currently Jewish? I think we know the answer to that. I think we have it. I think Svara, the organization, is a good example of one. I think Judaism Unbound, it turns out, is an example of one. So back to this question of maybe it's that new version of Judaism is a very different model where it's not Jew and non-Jew. You know, and I'm thinking about Buddhism today and how many people are participating in Buddhist activities, but they don't consider themselves Buddhist. What about people that are doing yoga, which is a part of Hinduism, but clearly they're not practicing Hinduism? I don't know how Hindus feel about that. One thing that I do know is that my son has celiac, which means that he can't eat gluten. And there are a lot of people in the world who say that they are gluten intolerant, meaning they don't have diagnosed celiac disease, but they feel that eating gluten makes them not feel good. And so they want to buy gluten-free products. If it wasn't for those people, my son wouldn't be able to get the gluten-free products that he needs to live because there wouldn't be enough of a market for it. So I'm really grateful to those people. There are people out there who say, oh, those people, they don't really have a disease and they're just pretending and they just are this and that. And I first of all, think that that's a terrible way to look at things. But second of all, I am so grateful for those people because they have created an economy that allows my son to live a good life. And so that also makes me think about, like, what would a world look like in which the technologies of Judaism were widely used? You didn't have to sign on the dotted line to be able to use them or not. And again, this goes back to that text. I think that text is so powerful, the one where Rabban Gamliel, he had this test for whether you could come into Yavne. And this is at the early stages of rabbinic Judaism. So I think it's really analogous. And he said your insides have to look like your outsides. And I have wondered whether that might be referring to converts.
I
saying
agree.
that a convert has an outside that looks non-Jewish, but an inside that is Jewish. And Rabban Gamliel was keeping them out of the center. They could be part of it, but he was keeping them out of the center. And only when they removed him from his position and removed the guards from the gates did all of those people come flooding in. And then Rabban Gamliel has this feeling like he feels faint. He says, perhaps I've withheld the Torah from Israel. At that point, I think you have to say he understood those to be Israel. They were Jews. They just didn't look like Jews, right, in his mind. And they wanted to be at the center. They had what to give to the center. And the Talmud says, once they flooded in, all the open questions on the table were resolved.
And as you've pointed out, the very first question they deal with is
to try to let in someone else who the Torah says shouldn't be allowed to be a Jew, and they figure out a way to let him be a Jew anyway.
Right. I love that.
You know, which I've said, you open the doors. The first thing the new people want to do is open the doors even farther. That's scary to certain people, like Lex was saying. That's scary to people. And I don't want to say, oh, those people don't know what they're talking about. No, that's real. You have a flood of new people coming in. It's not going to be the same anymore. And I feel like people have been sometimes told a false story when they've expressed worries that, for example, if we open the rabbinate to women, oh, nothing will change. Don't worry about it. No, of course things will change. You know, when you open the rabbinate to LGBTQ people, nothing's going to change. It's just, religious LGBTQ people that want to be rabbis. Of course things are going to change. It may be that the better approach is not to try to convince those people. You'll never convince them. They'll come eventually when the other thing is built up and super great. But don't waste your effort. And that's, back to what you were talking about before. Like, maybe we're wasting a lot of effort trying to tilt at windmills of saying, if only the organized Jewish community would support this work, when the reality is that there's a huge community out there that's already desperate to support this work, maybe not in quite the same way, maybe not to quite the same dollar amount, but represents an amazing future.
100%.
So I really appreciate this story with Rabban Gamliel, Dan, and it's becoming a nice little refrain in this conversion unit. So for listeners, know that when we repeat a story, it's not a rerun. It's a new layer of the spiral. Picture a spiral where you start in the middle and then you go out a layer and out a layer. But what you really emphasized that time is it was about the way people looked, potentially. I mean, and that's something we don't always say directly, and I don't know that we've said a ton. I mean, we touched on this with Marcus Holley a little bit, but like some of this is racism. And some of this, it's not quite racism, but there's not a one word term for it, but it's like the comfort that we feel looking around a room and thinking that we can spot Jews, that ism. Like we want to be able to look at people and say, oh, that person's like me, Jewishly. We know that that's already wrong. It's been wrong for a long time. There has never been one way to look Jewish. But what that story shows us is Gamliel was living a life and leading a rabbinic Judaism that early on was very concerned about not having people who looked a certain way that was marked as not Jewish. Now, we don't know what that was. We don't know whether that's... I don't want to say that Rabban Gamliel was racist, but I do know that today there is a conscious, sometimes, and often subconscious desire to be able to watch a TV show and say, oh, that person looks kind of Jewish. I'm going to look up, like, oh, they are. They're from, oh, they like... We create this image and we re-entrench that image over and over again. One way that we could seek to work on our Jewish communities that have so many problems with racism, that have so many problems with treating people who quote unquote don't look Jewish, who are born Jewish sometimes, as outsiders. One way to work on that would be to have more Jews who look like that. Now, I'm not going to like create a collective doctrine of let's have the marginalized people in our community like have a bunch of kids that look like that. Like that's not how I go about things, as much as our Jewish community has loved those kinds of strategies about reproducing people biologically. I do think that there is an argument to say like...
I'd like to throw recruitment in. You know, this was the accusation made against queer people, starting with... Anita Bryant, they recruit. They're going to recruit your children. I would like to adopt that as our slogan. We recruit. Maybe let's leave missionizing and proselytizing, and maybe we ought to adopt recruit. Anyway, sorry to have interrupted you.
No, but I think that's a really good push. I mean, I'm open to recruitment. I like that. I mean, I don't want it to sound like I'm saying, let's go into churches and like go to row 3. And like, I'm not saying that. For people who are deeply rooted in other religious systems and ways of living that work for them, I'm not here to say like, you got to proselytize. I'm not here to say like Judaism is a universal religion where everybody should be it and we should go to corners of the world. I'm not like advocating Mormon missions to Africa. Those come with all of the problems of colonialism. I am saying there are people already here. To use the analogy of the Rabban Gamliel, there are people at the door. They're often literally at the door. They're like coming to Torah study. There's often a lot of those people, and the only ones that I see the Jewish world actively trying to convert, because there is one corner that the Jewish world does actively try to convert, is spouses of Jews. That is the one corner that it seems normal to say, oh, you're married to a Jew? Like maybe you'd like to actually be the thing. And that I think is sometimes really abrasive, and it can be done too much. If we did that with people who are presenting themselves in spaces repeatedly and like expressing interest in Jewish communal participation, that could really go a long way towards serving us and breaking down this notion of looking Jewish that causes so much harm.
What if we stopped thinking about being the thing and we started thinking about doing the thing? I really think we need to get away from the identity issues again. And it's not, are you, aren't you? It's, do you, don't you? There are a lot of Jewish people who have a Jewish identity, but are not using the Jewish tradition to become Jewish kinds of people. For me, it's neither here nor there that their identity is Jewish. One way to look at the stuff we've come up with throughout our history is to recognize that every Jewish practice has three aspects to it. It has a historical reminder, a values reminder, and it has an identity reminder. Any practice, from a mezuzah to Shabbat to a sukkah to marriage ceremony, everything reminds you of where you've been, how you should operate in the world, and who you are. But the who you are is only there, and it's only valuable insofar as it loops you back into some other practice or some other Jewish piece of wisdom. It's not an end in of itself. It's a means to expose you to and help you use other stuff. And we've kind of lost track of everything except the identity piece, as if that's an end in and of itself, regardless of whether it's serving to hook you back into the stuff that actually changes you. What's the best way to help people, whether they identify as Jewish now, or maybe in the future, or maybe never, use the stuff of Judaism to become Jewish kinds of people?
I'm thinking about, like, what would be the analogous way that the text would go if we were writing it today? This text about the person who overheard that the high priest gets to wear this fancy clothes and says, that's why I want to be Jewish. And I loved what you said, Lex, about how the rabbis actually were not interested in that kind of Jewish anymore. That was over. So in a way, what they're saying is, like, whatever reason you have to want to be Jewish, it's fine. Because they could have said, oh, we don't want somebody who wants to be Jewish that way. That's the old way. But they didn't say that either, right? They said, you want to be Jewish? Fine. Now start learning this new way of being Jewish that we have. And so I'm wondering, like, would that be today? What would that sound like today? It's like somebody who, goes to services and they like the music and they say, I want to be Jewish because of the music. And we would say, oh, okay, whatever. That's not really, we're not really about services that much anymore. But you want to be Jewish because you like the music at services? Fine. Okay, you're Jewish. Now let's talk. Now let's start learning or something like that. And I guess I'm wondering about, like, how would this look in terms of this new way of thinking about a Jewish kind of person as opposed to a Jewish person? And we're saying, okay, what would these texts look like that say, okay, here's a story of a person who was actually trying to convert to the old kind of Judaism. Okay. Or what's the story about a person who's just saying, just tell me all of Judaism while I'm standing on one foot? And we're in this situation where we're saying, actually, Judaism is changing. How can I tell you? I don't even know. We don't know what it is anymore. But no, we say, oh, I could tell you it's believing in the oneness of everything. I don't know. What would that start to look like as we start to play out some of these examples? Like, one of the examples in the text was a person who converted by himself. And normally you're supposed to have witnesses in a kind of a court, but this person comes and says, I converted by myself. And the rabbis are like, well, do you have children? And he says yes. And they're like, okay, well, then it's okay, because we're not going to question your children's status because you did it the wrong way. So they just kind of have this, like, more open approach. And so I'm wondering, almost if we were writing the text for this next version of Judaism today, what would some of those examples of those stories sound like?
What occurs to me is the fact that it's not easy to answer that question, Dan. In other words, what is it about what Judaism has been that is so attractive to people that they identify it and say, that's what I want into? I don't think there's that much that we make available or accessible to people that they can identify and say, yeah, that's what I want. What we see at Svara is people come and say, I want to do that thing you're doing, that spiritual practice of learning with a partner. And that's a thing which, at Svara we make accessible, but which has been really kept hidden. Like, the really good stuff has been kind of protected and kept only for the elite of the elite and the insider of the insiders. And I think it's that's the stuff that we need to start making accessible.
I agree with that. I do think it's a hard question to answer. And I would say So what are the things people are looking at and wanting to do? Lifting people on chairs at a wedding. That is something, and I want to say that I'm not saying that like randomly or trying to be cute. I've been to a lot of weddings the last few years. I'm the age where a lot of my friends are getting married. I've been officiating a lot of weddings, but like I have now been to 2 different weddings where neither partner was Jewish, where they lifted chairs. And I've had a lot of conversations with people about this. And people feel, even very progressive people, there's a mixture of thoughts about this. And people love to talk about cultural appropriation. Like some people, interestingly, they're like, well, what music was playing? Like, I'd feel different about it if it was like Bruce Springsteen versus something. Like, it's happening. It's interesting to me. I think it shows a few things. One, lifting people on chairs as a Jewish thing, both lifting people on chairs generally and the fact that it's Jewish, has been made known to the world through some culture, through pop culture, it's a wedding. I think a lot of the things that are best known to like the world Jewishly are life cycle events, because people invite their non-Jewish friends to be mitzvahs. People invite their non-Jewish friends to weddings, and those are also showcased on TV and in films. I'm interested in the ways in which a theoretically trivial thing like lifting people on chairs at a wedding, I actually don't think it's trivial. I think it makes a huge difference to have a moment in the party, not the ceremony, the moment in the wedding party part that is tied to tradition. I think people actually really want to have the whole day feel special and not just the ceremony. And so one little thing of we're going to dance in a circle and lift on a chair, it doesn't matter if it's Hava Nagila. Having Hava Nagila might even help more. But like that does spiritual work for people, and it does it for folks who are Jewish, for not Jewish. Like it just feels like, oh, we've sanctified this part too.
I love that. I love that.
There's issues that can arise. I don't want to pretend this is all super easy. I want to be a voice saying that it brings me joy when the tradition of lifting people on chairs, which, to really emphasize, it is not like a Jewish legal tradition. It arises from the custom when men and women were dancing separate, and there was a separator in the middle, and so the husband and wife would only be able to see each other and dance together if they were lifted up over that. And I also, Dan, the celiac example you brought up is really impacting me. Like, I'm interested in the world where enough people do Jewish that certain Jewish things for people who are or are not or whatever become more normalized. There are municipalities in this country where Yom Kippur is a day off from school, and there are municipalities where it's not. Now, that correlates often with the number of people who quote unquote are Jewish, but to use Benay's terminology, I will tell you, my wife, she's not Jewish. She takes off for Yom Kippur because she's married to me, and she participates in Yom Kippur with me, and it's about her doing a thing, not being a thing. And if we had more people in more communities that were participating in Yom Kippur, whether they identified as Jewish or not, whether it's for marriage reasons, whether it's for friend reasons, whatever, that would lead to a world where Yom Kippur could be off from work more easily because more people would want it off from work. But to distill a little, I think we've got examples like lifting folks on chairs, and I think there's a reason to want to see the positive sides of those, not just the appropriative side of those, because it could lead to worlds where policies like governmental actions actually make life easier for Jews.
Yeah, and I guess just one thing that's coming up for me as I'm thinking about this and listening is just as I think about those stories in the Talmud, what strikes me, and I think you mentioned this earlier, Lex, or Benay, somebody did, that there's just a kind of a confidence that the rabbis have about the Judaism that they're developing that says, you come inside, I think you're going to like it. And so I don't have to make a barrier to entry because I'm confident that anybody who starts getting involved with this is going to get deeply involved and be really into it. And then we don't really have to worry that you're not going to be into it enough. I just don't believe that's going to happen. I feel that confidence about the Judaism that we're developing. And part of the reason I feel that confidence is exactly because I've had these conversations with people that are converting to Judaism. It's because I've had these conversations in our Judaism Inbound Intro to Judaism class where somebody asked me about God, and I laid out a kind of mindset about how I think about God these days in a non-normative sort of way, and everybody's kind of nodding and excited to hear it. So I feel confident that we're creating something that's really needed. And I agree with you that it's not recruiting from people that are satisfied and happy in the religious tradition of their birth or that they otherwise join. If anybody is happy somewhere, they should stay where they're happy for sure. But I believe this kind of dynamic Judaism that we're about is something that's extremely attractive to people that don't really have an alternative. And that's exactly the world of disruptive innovation, where it says that the people who want to buy a new product that maybe isn't fully developed yet are the people who currently have no product in that part of their lives. And your still developing product is way better than the nothing that they currently have. And I don't say that disparagingly. I say that as like, that's a great place to start. And then those people become part of the process of developing, and then it gets better and better and better. And so it's not about being confident that we currently have a Judaism that is awesome. It's being confident that we're on a road to a Judaism that will be awesome, and it will only be more awesome the more people join us on that road and in that process of development, because it will fold in all of their genius. So I feel so confident about that I don't feel any need to have any barrier to entry. And that's basically what it comes down to.
And when you're confident, you're not afraid you're going to lose something. Or maybe not being afraid you're going to lose something creates confidence. I don't know. But I've always thought that the rabbis were very open and courageous because there was nothing left to lose. It was already over. Their realization that there's no use holding on to the way Judaism has been, for them had been, gives you a sense of openness, and you're less afraid of who's going to come in because, oh, maybe they're going to threaten my safety. When there's nothing left to lose, you can be very courageous. And Lex, what you were saying about lifting people up in a chair really opened up my mind to other things that people look at and say, that's attractive to me. And I think we're still fairly effective at creating a certain kind of person who thinks a certain kind of way, who moves through the world with a certain amount of, I don't know, it depends, and sort of mental and emotional flexibility. And that's very attractive. I'm thinking of my mother and how deeply, deeply Jewish she is. And I see people who are not Jewish drawn to her because they sense in her some unique Jewishy way of being in the world. And they go, that's neat. That kind of way of being a person is really attractive. I want to be that kind of person. And I think that is something we do really well. And as I said before, that's what our whole Jewish project is, creating that certain kind of person.
Thank you so much, Benay. We could keep going for many, many hours, and hopefully we will in future reappearances of yours in our Svara Judaism Unbound cinematic universe. A real emailer used that phrase talking about us a couple weeks ago, the Judaism Unbound Svara cinematic universe. So I'm running with it. But thank you so much. This has been a fantastic conversation.
This was so fun. Thank you.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. A reminder, JudaismUnbound.com/classes. That's the place to learn about our new offerings in the Anya Shiva, our fall full semester courses. There's 5 of them. They're super, super amazing, featuring past guests on the podcast, guests that will be coming up in just a couple weeks, Rachel Rose Reed and Tamar Kamiankowski. You do not want to miss these amazing opportunities. Just head to JudaismUnbound.com/classes to learn more. And of course, we want to close out our conversation in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us. Send us your questions, your thoughts, your visions, your dreams, your arguments, any of it. You can do so in a variety of ways. First, there's our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram feeds. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, there's our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And third, you can email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last request we like to make is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you're able to send our way. And you can do that on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift via JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thanks so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.